I'm Catherine Lord. I'm a principal consultant at Cordis Bright. I joined in March. So just for some background, it used to be the budget survey, and it was a survey of all of the directors of adult social care. So there's 143 at the moment, but the scope has widened out of just their budgets. So it's about looking to the future, what they think some of the current challenges are. And they have a pretty high response rate. I mean, if I was doing a survey in another sector, I would be really happy with a 94% response rate. But it means that there's 10 directors that didn't get back to us. So these results have been extrapolated to include everybody. So there may be some differences if we'd have had all of that. And like I say, it's kind of a snapshot of how they see the world at the moment, but also focusing on how they see the future. So I'll touch a bit on that. We just wanted to sort of preface this, and Josh and Julian have kind of already touched on this, but about kind of the context of where this survey is in the wider world. So we're all aware of the inflation rates and that it's continuously going up. But I think it's just important to kind of remind ourselves that it is has been constantly going up. And so the impacts of that in terms of social care, as I'm sure you're very well aware, particularly on kind of overhead costs, the national living wage. It's an expensive time to be providing these services. So just as we're going through this and you're kind of getting a picture of some of the overall responses, it might be worth kind of keeping that in mind. And as it says, it didn't fall below 9% over the period that this survey is relating to. So councils have a budget, and within that budget, they all need to make savings within that. So it was relatively sort of consistent around kind of 2 billion. And I think I also wanted to just point out that's £billion. I think the B and the M can be interchangeably seen, but that is a huge amount of money, £2 billion. And there was a significant dip in terms of savings, which we probably all know the reasons for, but it's back. The trend is that it's going to be back on track for 2.5 billion. We've just put there that there is missing data, so that wasn't for quite a lot of this. There's missing data within the 2020-21 period because it just wasn't collected for obvious reasons. So in terms of a net budget for councils, they have a budget of £51 billion. And so they're expected to save about 5% of that across all of their expenditure. So again, that's kind of context about some of the data that you might see going forward about where things are being spent and some of the challenges that people foresee in the future. I don't know if everybody's aware of this and if I'm sort of preaching to the choir, but there's a tax or an additional council tax called the social care precept, which is specifically ring-fenced for funding on adult social care. So it's up to the councils to set that limit. So they're allowed to set it up to 2%. If they go over that limit, then they have to hold a referendum, so nobody goes over 2%. So this is just an audit of the councils and at what percent they are charging that precept. So most, 94%, are charging it at the 2%, so they have that additional funding coming in that is specifically ring-fenced for adult social care. But there are some councils that are not charging it at such a high limit. Generally, those ones are Tory constituencies. I don't know if there's a direct link there. You can discuss that amongst yourselves. But there's not really been much change. Generally, if they've set that percentage rate, then that's maintained over the last couple of financial years. And then just generally in terms of the adult social care budget, you may be aware of this, you may not, but it has been steadily increasing over the year from 15 billion and is now up to 17-18 billion pounds for adult social care. What's interesting, and the point that we wanted to kind of make here, was that this bar on the bottom, I'm pointing, but I realise not everybody might see it, is that generally the percentage of that budget that has been spent on adult social care has remained the same. So regardless of more funding being putting in, the percentage that's still having to be spent is basically the same, 36-37%. There's a discussion there about, well, why is it now because we're supporting more people and we're managing to reach the people that we needed to reach, but also that is a huge percentage out of the budget, out of the whole council budget, that is going towards a generally small population of people. So it's just something to consider, that it's a huge part of the budget for a relatively small group of individuals, and we can go on to talk about that. Something that's been really interesting from looking at the survey results was then a discussion that actually there's been a huge uptick in the number of councils that are having to dip into their reserves in order to fund adult social care. So despite the budgets going up, a lot of places are having to delve into their reserves to be able to pay from it. So it was 37% last year, and now it's up at 72%. So there's been a real uptick in that, and you can see that here. So this is from the Viewfinder survey, which some of you may have participated in or not. But this shows that proportion, or the percentage of people that have spent at least 10% of their reserves in order to support underfunded services has just steadily increased over time. There was a bit of a peak for some unknown reason in around 2015, 2016. But I mean, we've gone from 6% 10 years ago to almost 26% of councils' funding with going into the reserves to pay for funding to support underfunded services. So to sort of try and address this, there was the social care grant allocation from central government. So this was 2.5 billion and then went up to 3.8 billion. So there was money given from central government to try and support councils to pay for this. It's up to local councils to decide where that money is spent. So it's a social care grant, it's not an adult social care grant. So there's huge variation between where councils have decided to spend that. So this graph here on the left, the 100%, they have spent 100% of their social care grant allocation on adult social care. But this gap here on the right is a purposeful gap, is that some councils didn't spend any money on adult social care. It all went, for instance, on children's social care. The average allocation is 61%, so it is getting the bulk, but we just thought it was really interesting to show that there is a vast variation between councils about where this money is going. So in the survey, they were asked about where money is being, where they think. A lot of this is where they think things are happening. It might not match necessarily hard and fast data. So this is more of their opinions of where they think money is being saved. Really in the top two, so they think that they're doing more for less. A weakness, just to kind of flag up with this, is that 28% of them said other, which we don't have any information on what that means. So somewhere about a third of the money is being saved on these other activities. If we were doing the survey, we would ask them a bit more about what that other might entail. Maybe that's something we can do in the future. But in sort of line with this, many local authorities aren't increasing their fees in line with the inflation of 9%. And like we said, a third of directors think that they're promoting this sort of asset-based self-help prevention agenda. But really the spending, if you look at the spending on that, it really does seem to lag behind what is actually happening. So on the right is short-term care. So this would be maybe more towards the kind of prevention, asset-based self-help approach. And you can just see the stark difference. The left is long-term care. So they're putting their money into long-term care. The dark green is over 65s. The purple is 18 to 64. But historically, money has been spent and is locked in to long-term care. So despite them thinking that they're promoting this self-help kind of prevention approach, the money just isn't speaking to that. So that would make us think that that's probably not happening in reality, even though they might be talking the talk. And then we asked a bit about, I'm saying we, I didn't ask, ADASS survey asked about the cost pressures. So number one hasn't changed over the last couple of years. So they think the biggest cost pressure is the price of the care packages, particularly for those with complex needs. That is the most expensive thing. The main shift really is that the unit price of care is increasing for other reasons, so that's around inflation really, is that national living wage has increased and all the other associated costs with providing care have obviously increased. Yeah, it's really not quite clear because if you do look in quite detail about that, there's a mixed picture about what they're worried about. And in sort of contradiction to, again, what they've said about focus on prevention, when they were asked about where they think they'll struggle the most, these second bars along here, so here, that's prevention and well-being, they now think they'll struggle most with that, even though they think that they're making the most savings there. So they're not sort of consistent in how they think they'll tackle that. But the main area where they think they will struggle is the sustainability of the market, which is quite concerning, but that's obviously around things like national living wage inflation, increases in costs. And there's been a marked uptick in that. And I think that has come as a realisation of during COVID, the sort of fragility of the market, and that providers were closing and that some of them struggled. And I think that that's a concern going forward, given the kind of projections of costs and how much people are struggling with that. So in terms of the kind of costs drivers for services, and we've touched a bit on this, but it's no shock to sort of see that in residential and nursing care, overheads are kind of the main drivers of costs. So food, rent, bills, particularly in older people's residential care. Heating, for instance, is going to be extortionately expensive. And then this is followed by recruitment and retention and national living wage. Whereas in home care, recruitment and retention is the highest cost driver of services, and the national living wage, and then again other pay pressures. We're not quite sure exactly what that means, but there's obviously a less consideration in home care for things like overheads because of the type of care that they're providing. And then, as I said, in terms of kind of service closures and the disruption, particularly during COVID, and that linking to the kind of market sustainability, there was an estimate of about 8,000 people have been disrupted by service closures in just the last 6 months alone. So that's quite a significant increase since November of about 14%. And really this is within home care that we're seeing that here. This table at the bottom is about contract handback, and you'll see it's pretty similar for kind of all provided for nursing and residential care, but there's obviously been kind of a 5-point increase in home care providers handing back contracts. It's not a huge difference really, but I think it's something to note, and it will be interesting if that's a trend that seems to continue as time goes on. And then in terms of the home care hours provided, again, there's a 6-month gap in the data here because that wasn't collected. But the dark blue is the hours delivered, and the light blue is hours not delivered purely because of staffing capacity. So that peaked here at the beginning of 2020. There are over 2 million hours of home care not provided because of lack of staff capacity. So there's been a really encouraging decrease in that, but there's still 500,000 hours of home care not provided due to lack of capacity within the system. So it's definitely a concern. But I think if you see what is encouraging is the huge jump. Like I say, there is 6 months of data missing, which would probably hopefully be about here. But there has been a jump from 42 million to 54 million hours of home care provided. So that's probably linked to the social care grants, maybe to the precept, but the market has definitely increased its provision, but it's still not meeting the demand is the kind of picture. And then just to touch on the local government and the NHS, and I'm sure we could all talk about this for quite some time, but obviously and historically there's potentially a disconnect between the goals and the aims and priorities of social care and those of the NHS. And for the NHS, particularly at the moment, primary objective is discharge, getting people out of hospital, getting those beds free. So directors were asked about what could support the NHS objectives with that, but also what role they play kind of in that picture. This is about actions that would support improvement in the intermediate care, so people coming out immediately from discharge. So if we'd have asked this to the NHS, we envisaged that it would have been completely flipped the other way around. So at the bottom, it's about a primary focus on discharge. 1 to 10 to 11% think that's a very significant impact. Whereas actually what directors want is long-term ring-fenced funding and a really balanced focus, not just on discharge, but on admission avoidance and the community response, which personally I think makes perfect sense. It's not just about getting people out of hospital, it's about the whole package within the community. Like I say, it would be interesting to ask that question of NHS colleagues and see if it's just the flip reverse, basically. The other area where there's some tension is about the continuing healthcare. So that's where, for those that don't know, NHS pay some of a person's care because their needs are primarily health rather than social care. The picture here, so the green is strongly agree and agree is green. So the NHS funded nursing care rate is insufficient to retain and recruit nurses working in social care in the area. So the NHS aren't giving them enough money to be able to provide the care, so the health is not paying them enough. The NHS is you can tell Tom's written the NHS is cost shunting back to local government. So there's been a trend of reviewing people who qualified for continuing healthcare to find they no longer qualify, which means they then need council-funded social care. Continuing healthcare, the number of disputes escalated for local resolution has increased. So there was an argument between the NHS and local government about who should be paying for this individual's care. There's been a decrease in the availability of nursing homes offering places for people who qualify for continuing healthcare. So even if they provide the money, there's actually not the service provision within that community to support that individual. Overall, the number of people qualifying for continuing healthcare has decreased. You could argue there's no good reason for this decline other than the cost shunting exercise that we've sort of alluded to. So that's some messy kind of context there between local governments and the NHS. Again, just to reiterate, they're putting all their kind of money and focus into this discharge process and then looking to local government and cost shunting traditionally things that they may have been paying for in terms of people's care. Just to pick it back up though, they did say that the engagement with the NHS reform is getting better over time. So directors felt that this is to do with the integrated care system. This is from 2022-23 and then this is the recent survey. So we could argue that they're feeling more engaged. Maybe there's better conversations being had. It's taking time. No one's not engaged, which I think is encouraging, but I'm very much trying to look for the silver lining here. So I think there's still work to be done. And obviously, if you think of the previous slide, that might be some of the underlying tension there that might be going on. And then in terms of individuals, organisations being well connected to the integrated care systems within their area, that is not doing as well. And it may be that the people that responded to this are not the people involved in those conversations. So that's just clearly their opinion on the process, but that seems to be going down. So there's a slight mixed message there, shall we say. So it's a bit about the precept and that most people are charging that. But even though they're doing this, and there's the things like the social care grant, they're having to dip into their reserves to be able to support services at the moment. There's just not sufficient funding there. And then the biggest drain on cost is the prices. I think that is justified and there's not much in their control there. And I think there's a feeling that they're being expected to pick up what health is no longer focusing on and that health is focused on discharge. And then, to sum up, the directors were pretty unhappy and seemed pretty uncertain about the future.